I'm often asked why I made the decision to study Russia. And of course, the answer to that is long and torturous and involves a lot of personal reasoning. But the simple answer is because I find it a fascinating place. And it's fascinating because it's a land of extremes. It's a place where the extremes in one direction and another can be true at the very same time. And I think in terms of understanding the US-Russia relationship, you really have to start, if you're an American, by understanding the country that you're dealing with, Russia. And so I offer this kind of metaphor of a land of extremes as a way of understanding Russia a little bit better as we think about the US relationship with Russia. Just to give a few examples, anyone who's ever been to Moscow in the last 10 years will be very familiar with the image of Moscow as a place of tremendously great wealth, concentrated wealth. A lot of this, of course, is energy extraction money, it's oil money, it's gas money, but it manifests itself in really conspicuous consumption in Moscow today, the capital city, to some extent in other large cities, but basically not at all anywhere else in Russia. And so the result is a really extreme gap between the very wealthy in Russia and the very poor. There's a joke that Russians often tell about the so-called new Russians, where Ivan says to Sergei, "Hey, Sergei, I just got this awesome new watch. Isn't it great? I paid $15,000 for it." And Sergei says, "Ivan, ty durak, you're such an idiot. You can buy it across the street for $30,000. The idea being that the more you've paid for something, the better, because these folks are rolling in money and they don't know what to do with it. And that, unfortunately, is the reality of Russia today, but it has been for a very long time too. So it's a land of really extreme differences between the wealthy and the poor. Incredibly, for those of us in the United States who maybe think of Russia very much in sort of traditional Tsarist terms or in Soviet terms, it's actually a very multicultural place. It's a pluralistic society in which you have people of Asian descent, you have people from the North Caucasus, you even have some people from Africa who are actually born in Russia and are integrated into the society for better or for worse. It's quite a pluralistic place, and yet at the same time, it is the most prejudiced place I think I've ever been. You will hear statements from Russians that are more unimaginably racist than anything you would hear in the American South. So this is a real contradiction in Russian society, and again, it has been for a very long time. It's also a land of tremendous creativity, of intellectual opportunity, of scientific development. It's literally the place that invented the term intelligentsia, and with good reason. You know, there have been great Russians from the writers Dostoevsky and Tolstoy, and the composers Tchaikovsky, Mussorgsky. I mean, you can just sort of feel the weight of Russian intellectual culture. And yet at the same time, it is a place of unbelievable ignorance and superstition. And these two things really coexist not only in the same country, but very often in the same city or village, the same family, and sometimes in the same individual. I find this fascinating. And lastly, this is sort of an old joke going back to the Soviet times. It was always said that the Soviet Union has the most democratic constitution in the world. And in fact, if you read the Constitution, it was awfully democratic, at least the way it was written. But that was where it ended. In fact, in implementation, in the reality of daily life in the Soviet Union, there was very little democracy. In fact, I would say none at all. And that gap still exists in Russia today. It's the extreme difference between the aspiration that's encapsulated in the laws, in the philosophies of Russian government, very often in the speeches of its leaders. You hear that from President Medvedev today, who talks about stopping corruption, modernizing Russian society, and of course the reality, when you see it in daily life, is that it is one of the most corrupt places on earth. You know, it's constantly at the very bottom of the list of Transparency International and Freedom House and things like that. So again, these two things are true at the very same time. It has great aspirations for democracy, transparency, and modernization, but in reality, it's nowhere near that. And I think this is essential to understanding Russia, is to recognize that even though you're hearing something, that doesn't necessarily mean that it is universally or uniformly true, but that contradiction is nowhere near as troubling to the Russian that you're dealing with as it is to you. And I think that's something you have to adjust to when you're engaging with Russia. Let me offer just a couple of other metaphors for thinking about Russia. One I think is very important is to understand why is it seemingly so essential for Russia to have a powerful authoritarian state, and why does it constantly need to be exerting its influence beyond its borders. There are many countries which enjoy national power and national wealth in ways that don't impinge directly on the countries around it. Russia has traditionally not been a country like that. It seeks a sphere of influence. And the explanation that I have for this is that Russia is a country that sort of believes in the mantra of expand or die. And if you look at Russian history, there's good reason for that. Going back to the early 1600s, the so-called time of troubles, the smutnaya vremya, Russia was suffering simultaneously external contraction, as at that point its young empire was being pushed back on all sides. At the same time, it was suffering famine and drought and autocratic government and pretenders to the throne internally. So the Russian people were suffering. And that wasn't the only time that this happened. I think it set the precedent, and this term, smutnaya vremya, time of troubles, is repeated throughout Russian history. But you look into the 19th century, the Napoleonic Wars, Moscow was burned, wars with Turkey, wars in the North Caucasus, at the same time that there is famine and suffering and slavery, indeed serfdom going on within Russia itself. So the conception in the Russian people's minds and the kind of philosophy of being Russian is very much when we are under assault from the outside, we are also suffering within. If you look at World War I, it's interesting that what certainly started out as a defeat at the hands of Germany and the Central Powers, and in fact you could argue ended as a defeat because Russia pulled out of the war before the ultimate Allied victory, also included revolution, civil war, famine. This was recently, I thought, memorialized very well in a documentary on PBS called The Great Famine, about the US effort to feed and save Russians in the early 1920s, which was led by Herbert Hoover, the American Relief Administration. The point is there's an amazing story inside Russia itself that we in the West don't pay very much attention to, that as it was being defeated on the battlefields externally and pushed back, so too internally were the Russian people suffering. Of course, the siege of Leningrad, World War II, the battles of Stalingrad, the Nazi incursion, the invasion into the Soviet Union, these things too were all associated in the minds of Russians with the suffering and the privation that they experienced at home. The Cold War was perhaps proof of the opposite. As Russia's influence rebuilt and expanded, there was some prosperity during the Khrushchev period and the early Brezhnev period. Russians really lived much better than they had before. And then this was followed in 1991 again by the collapse of empire. So as they withdrew externally, so too did life become chaotic. There's real, when you talk to Russians about the 1990s, it is not primarily for them a story of regained freedom. It is primarily a story of economic suffering and deprivation once again. And so we come to today, the last decade, the 2000s, as Putin came to power, Russia really was resurgent once again. But you notice that resurgence was both international and domestic. People lived better at home, but Russia's influence globally also expanded. So this has been a pattern back and forth throughout Russian history. And we really can't forget that when we're dealing with Russia in the post-Soviet space, in Europe, in North Africa, wherever, in Asia, we're dealing with a Russia that closely associates how powerful it is internationally with how well Russians are living at home. The final metaphor I think that's important for understanding Russia is this notion of the good Tsar. Why is it that Russians seem to crave, or at a minimum accept, autocracy in a way that we in the West typically don't? Is it that there's something deeply psychological that Russians just love autocrats, they like to be dictated to? I actually don't believe that. I know enough Russians, and I've had enough conversations where you have 2 Russians and 6 opinions, that I know that can't be the case. I think to some extent what's going on is, if you look at the country, if you look at the kind of geopolitical position of Russia, there are ways in which it is reasonably well suited to autocracy, or perhaps better suited than other countries. But of course, there are holes in the argument because Canada is perhaps similarly geopolitically situated. It's a cold climate. It tends to be a very forbidding and difficult and spread out place. It's a hard place in which to maintain close social cohesion that would be required for the sort of classic Greek notion of democracy, a fully engaged polis. And so in that sense, it's better if you can have a very strong central power that kind of sends unidirectional orders out. Also geopolitically, it has traditionally been very vulnerable on all sides. You have an expansionist Persian empire in the south, you have an Ottoman empire, you have, obviously the German, Austro-Hungarian cluster, the Swedish empires, all sort of attacking from different directions, even war with Japan 100 years ago, and then in World War II as well. And then of course you have the phenomenon of inertia, the fact that this is a very big place It is a place where change does not happen quickly because of distances, because of technological backwardness, and for that reason, even when there is revolution, whether it's the Tsar taking on Christianity and deciding we will go from being a pagan nation to being a Christian nation, to the Bolshevik revolutionaries throwing out the Tsarist and the Menshevik government and declaring Russia to be the first communist or socialist state, at least, the changes tend to be skin deep, at least for a while, because there's a lot of inertia in Russia, and it took, in fact, 80 years for the communists to build their rule, with many people dying along the way, and in the end, even that could not be held onto. And so for that reason, I suggest that there's an inertia that kind of keeps authoritarianism as a current strain in Russian society. There's always also been tension between upheaval from the bottom and reform from the top. And I think we see that in Russia today, but you can go back 100 years ago, the Tsarist government was attempting to reform to try and kind of create a pressure release valve for the social unrest that they saw. But at the same time, of course, Bolsheviks and anarchists and other revolutionaries were attempting to destabilize things from below. I think we see all of this, all of these metaphors that I've laid out for understanding Russia, encapsulated in what's become the core question for Westerners who study Russia, and that's Putin versus Medvedev. It's sort of the horse race that defines everything in Russia today. But not because these individuals, Putin and Medvedev, are so fundamentally critical to Russia. They're not. Putin could disappear tomorrow and somebody would step into his shoes and represent the same things that he represents. And I'll talk a little bit more about what all of that means. But first, let me address what I think is also a pretty fundamental question if you're going to talk about the US-Russia relationship, and that's, why does Russia matter for the United States? Why should we pay attention? I think it was one thing during the Cold War where Russia was constantly, as the Soviet Union was constantly on our radar screen because they forced themselves to be. I think the challenge today is Russia isn't necessarily relevant to everything that we do, so why should we think about it and when should we think about it? The first reason is something of a holdover from the Cold War, and that's that Russia has the only weapon in the world that poses a truly existential threat to the United States, and that is the Russian nuclear arsenal. You could imagine the worst of worst scenarios. Even a terrorist exploding a nuclear device in a major American city is not going to destroy the United States of America. Russia maintains the capability to do that on a relatively short timetable, and we have to take that seriously, even though it is a very, very unlikely occurrence. Second, also something of a legacy of Russia's past, it maintains a permanent veto power on the UN Security Council, and that's essential for American interests in many other places around the world. So, for example, Russia was the swing vote that enabled the UN resolution on Libya, that allowed the US and NATO intervention there, and Russia was also essential for imposing sanctions on Iran. Russia's geographically large, that's obvious to anybody who looks at a map. It has borders on Central Asia. Think about our interests in Afghanistan, and just south of there in the India-Pakistan area. On East Asia, think about the economic centrality of China to the United States, you know, the Chimerica economic relationship. Well, Russia is right there. Russia has even historically occupied parts of China, and the relationship between Russia and China in Central Asia, I think, is going to be extremely important for the United States and others to watch in the future. Just in terms of Russia's physical presence, its environment, it has some of the biggest forests in the world. Lake Baikal in Siberia contains 20% of the world's non-frozen fresh water. So just consider the sheer size of Russia to be a reason that you might want to pay attention. Economically, Russia is the world's 12th largest market. It has the 3rd largest reserves of foreign currency. During economic tough times, that becomes pretty important, and indeed it was important for Russia in 2009. And Russians tend to have a proclivity for US luxury goods, which means they buy an awful lot of US brands. The Ford Focus, for example, was the best-selling car in Russia in 2009, and that looks set to continue. Boeing sold $50 billion worth of aircraft to Russia in 2010. In terms of its energy supplies, obviously Russia is an energy superpower, self-described. It provides approximately 40% of Germany's natural gas, and for other European countries, particularly the Baltic states and Eastern and Central Europe, 80 to 100%, which means there is real dependency, but also mutual dependency between America's transatlantic allies and Russia. Russia can be essential, I think, in a number of 21st century challenges. It's proven that. It has disaster relief capabilities, which rival those of the United States because of its history and its size. It has very impressive cyber capabilities, which could be used for good or could be used for ill. And of course, Russia has probably a greater interest, even than the United States does, in stemming the flow of trafficking, going east-west. Much of it goes through Russian territory, much of it involves Russians acting illicitly, but in terms of the interests of the Russian state, they are very, very focused on stopping trafficking. Many of the what are called frozen or protracted conflicts in the world today. We obviously saw one that became not so frozen very quickly in Georgia in 2008, but many of these are located on the periphery of the old Soviet Union, and that means that Russia not only has kind of a historic and a cultural, and in some cases a direct economic tie to these conflicts, but that Russia is sort of looked to as the major international arbiter to bring these things to a close. All right, so we've laid out some basic kind of concepts and rationale for understanding Russia and why we want to pay attention. Why is it that the Russia-US relationship has been so difficult? What's the problem? I think there are a number of answers to that. I don't think any of them are simple, and none of them are absolutely true. There are exceptions to all of them. But the first reason I'd give is that there have traditionally been very high expectations. Whether you're talking about the Soviet era, where Moscow and Washington, the two global superpowers, come together to solve some sort of problem, there was an expectation that they actually could. The reality was very often that neither one could, and the two of them probably couldn't together either. Today, the problem, I think, in the relationship is we have very high expectations relative to the period that we went through over the last 10 years. That is to say, the things we got wrong, we think that we can easily turn around and get right. If you listen to the rhetoric coming out of Washington or coming out of Moscow, President Obama and President Medvedev will have another summit, or probably two summits this summer. There'll be very high-flying rhetoric. I think the reality is there's not a lot of low-hanging fruit left for these two countries to get done together. I think that the progress in the relationship is further limited by what I'll call zero-sum thinking. It has a different way of manifesting itself on the US side and the Russian side. Oftentimes on the Russian side, it's what you might call conspiratorialism, the belief that the United States is engaged in some sort of global revolutionary conspiracy, that the CIA is directing color revolutions all around the world. False or true, these types of beliefs tend to undermine the effectiveness of US-Russia cooperation. Third is, Russia is not really a political issue for the United States. I mean that in a good sense, in that unless things get really nasty, American voters tend not to pay attention to problems that we have with Russia. But it's bad in that when an American president, like President Obama, invests a tremendous amount of his political capital in improving relations with Russia, there is very seldom a return on that investment in domestic political terms. It's just not something that would be viewed as a vote getter in the same way that, for example, the Northern Ireland conflict was actually a very big domestic political issue because of constituencies in the United States. Think about the Boston area, where I went to school and joined Phi Beta Kappa, that really care a lot about that issue. There just are not a lot of constituencies in the United States that care a lot about Russia. And of course, we do have presidential elections coming up both in the United States and in Russia, and also at the end of 2011 there'll be a Duma, a parliamentary election in Russia. And so, politics tend to militate against investment in the US-Russia relationship. The fourth reason, I think, for there being a problem is sort of bureaucratic inertia. And this is a little different from zero-sum thinking. What I mean by this is that those people who occupy not the most senior positions, but nonetheless critical positions through the middle of the hierarchy in the US government and the Russian government, whether it's foreign ministry or defense positions or energy or agriculture, whatever it is, tend not to be very interested in changing the pattern of how they do what they do. And so when they get an order from the top that says, all right, now it's time to cooperate with Russia on climate change, or now it's time to cooperate with Russia on counter-trafficking in Afghanistan, there's usually an awful lot of resistance. And that proves to be more and more and more of a problem the more specific and concrete your goals become, rather than simply having summits and saying nice things and agreeing not to kill each other. Lastly, I think we have a really fundamental problem in the US-Russia relationship if you compare it to the US relationship with other countries. France, Brazil, Egypt even, what have you. There is no strong domestic constituency that cares about relations with Russia. If you even look at some of the emigre communities, people who have their roots in Russia, and there are quite, there are many millions of them in the United States, it tends to be that they are not deeply invested. And the reasons for that are various, but I would suggest that one of them is simply that they don't have a lot of love for their homeland. Very often it's, they're over here because they couldn't live over there anymore. And so I think that means that the US side and the Russian side both have to sort of approach this in a top-down way. The governments have to say, well, we're going to cooperate, we're going to do X, Y, and Z, and governments don't really have the capacity that the grassroots, that average citizens have when they say, well, we're going to cooperate, so we're just going to go out and do it. My church group is going to link up with a church group over in France, and we're going to do this activity. That doesn't happen very often with Russia. So what has this problematic relationship produced in terms of problems? I think without even going further back in history to the Cold War, there's an easy set of examples from the last decade. Before the Obama 2009 reset policy, we had a very troubled period in the US-Russia relationship. President Bush had set out with Russia to try to cooperate, in his view, like two normal countries. The idea being, we work together when we want to work together, when it makes sense, and we don't when we don't have shared interests. Unfortunately, he found pretty quickly that that didn't work. Russia sought a lot more attention than that and was dissatisfied with the amount of focus that the United States was turning elsewhere, particularly in the war on terror, and the United States was unwilling to accept Russia's somewhat ambivalent answer to the "you're with us or you're against us" proposition. As a result, our trade relations, our security cooperation stagnated. We entered into competition in the post-Soviet space. For example, zero-sum game. Either we influence Georgia and bring it into NATO, or Russia holds on to Georgia. Same thing happened in Central Asia. The US plans to erect a missile defense system in Europe were viewed as a provocation by Russia, as an explicit attempt to undermine Russia's nuclear deterrent, and this is of course fundamental, because as the Russian conventional military capability degrades, and in some cases intentionally is reduced because it's very expensive to maintain Cold War era sized military, then its nuclear deterrent becomes even more and more essential to its national security. And if the United States can shoot down Russian nuclear missiles, then of course it has no real deterrent. That's at least the Russian perception. It's a little trickier, but I think there was also a significant decline for what you might call personal reasons or personal political reasons. On the plus side of the ledger, Bush and Putin allegedly got along very well. But on the negative side, I think there was a lack of real trust between the two of them. I think there may have been a sense of the two of them that, we're people who understand each other and where we're coming from, but that doesn't mean that we can actually work together. Whereas if you look at today, I think it's the opposite. These are leaders who maybe don't understand each other, don't maybe get along as well, but have agreed to work together and are in fact working together. That was backward in the past. Just, an intriguing and sort of depressing example of how US-Russia relations have gone badly was during the 2008 war between Russia and Georgia. And, I don't think it's right at all to say that the United States had much of a role in provoking that war. I think that was very much about decisions taken by the Georgian side, by the Abkhaz and South Ossetian separatists, and by the Russians. But look at what the American response was when Russia invaded. There was reportedly actually a debate within the National Security Council about whether to bomb Russian troops moving into Georgia. It's almost unimaginable what the consequences of a direct US bombing of Russian forces in the post-Soviet space would have been, but I would submit they would have been very, very bad. Russia, in turn, mobilized its forces against US warships, which had moved into the Black Sea region to provide relief, bottled water, allegedly, was the argument to the Georgians. And then, of course, the NATO-Russia Council, which is something that we had set up at the end of the Cold War. Rather than inviting Russia to join NATO, Russia would have sort of an equal relationship with NATO, and they'd have this council. It didn't work at all. It didn't meet at all during the course of this conflict, and has only very recently started working again. So this was the environment into which Obama stepped when he became president in 2009, and to which he sought to apply his vision of the US-Russia relationship, and that has become known as the reset. That was announced actually in a speech by Vice President Biden in February of 2009, so very early in the relationship. The philosophy was, let's clear the air. Psychologically, let's get rid of the baggage that we have. Let's just agree that we're going to sort of start over. We're not going to forget about history. We know history is there, but we're going to try and be pragmatic and move forward. In a lot of ways, it sounded like Bush's initial approach, at least the sort of the pre-9/11 Bush administration approach. But I think the benefit that you had with Obama and Medvedev is, although they are very, very different people, and I think they come from very, very different places, the two of them saw themselves as real pragmatists. They saw themselves as both being modern leaders. They didn't have Cold War baggage. They're both young. They were process-oriented people. They wanted to put a plan into place and then execute that plan step by step. And so they created something called the Bilateral Presidential Commission. This was officially stood up after the July 2009 summit between the two leaders. It has more than a dozen working groups. I think today the count stands at 18 that deal with everything from the Arctic and energy issues, environmental issues, to nuclear weapons. The idea behind the commission is that these working groups are supposed to be very flexible. They're supposed to communicate when possible by video teleconference. They're supposed to use email. These are things that were never done. I mean, truly never ever done in the US-Russia relationship, notwithstanding that the technology has been there on both sides. It just was not viewed as something that you did. In the past, US-Russia relations were always handled across a negotiating table with flags, with a wide array of officials in big plenary sessions. And Obama and Medvedev sort of made the decision, we're not going to approach it this way. We're going to be pragmatic and flexible and adapt. The two presidents have had over a dozen face-to-face meetings at this point. They've literally had hours of phone calls, including negotiating some of the finer points of the New START agreement together directly on the telephone. Again, pretty much unprecedented in US-Russia relations. They did manage to get the New START treaty signed. President Obama was able to get it ratified, and the Russians followed very quickly before the end of last year. A new so-called 1-2-3 nuclear cooperation agreement went into force between the US and Russia last year as well. And what this enables is that the US and Russia can now share nuclear technology. And that's important for cooperating on civilian nuclear power research, which in the aftermath of the Fukushima disaster is even more obviously important, that we have to share safety technology, non-proliferation technology, and of course commercial opportunities. You know, as more and more countries recognize the limitations of relying on fossil fuel for their energy, more and more will seek, of course, to build nuclear power plants, and we want them to be the safest and most effective and reliable that they can be. The United States and Russia have had some impressive cooperation since 2009 on counterterrorism and counter-narcotics. There are two examples that really stand out for me. In August of 2010, the US and Russia jointly conducted an exercise simulating the hijacking of a small airliner. So you actually had American and Russian and I think Canadian officers, because Canada is part of NORAD, our air defense system, sitting on this airplane and being followed by American fighter jets halfway over the Pacific, and then taking over where Russian fighter jets sort of, you know, wiggled their wings at each other and then took over, tracking that simulated hijacked airplane over the Bering Strait. And then in September of 2010, there was a joint raid, and when I say joint, I mean American boots and Russian boots on the ground in the AFPAC border region to take out a heroin-producing drug lab, which is, of course, hugely important for Russia, but also for the United States because of our role in Afghanistan. And you know, given Russia's historic baggage of having troops in Afghanistan, where they had a decade-long occupation that ended rather badly for them, that is an enormous sort of vote of confidence for US-Russia cooperation. And then, of course, today, probably the most important achievement, if you talk to US national security officials, is that we have a northern distribution network which enables supplies, including lethal supplies, which means guns and bullets, to pass through the Russian Federation, through Central Asia, and into Afghanistan. And that gives us an alternative to the supply route through Pakistan, which, given tensions with Pakistan today, is extremely important for the United States. So that's where the reset has taken us so far, and I would submit that by and large, on balance, this has been very positive for the US and Russia. But I think then the question is, where do we go from here? I mentioned that I think a lot of the low-hanging fruit has been picked. I don't think that there are a lot of major accomplishments remaining for us, but there are a few. And the first is in the area of trade and economics. In 2009, the US and Russia had a $24 billion trade relationship. That's not very much. It grew by 50% in 2010 to 36 billion. That was mostly an artifact of the economic recovery, but that is still less than 0.5% of total United States trade. So what that means is the US and Russia do not have a deep economic stake in their relationship with one another. They have a lot of indirect trade relationships. In other words, we share a lot of major trading partners like Germany and China, but our direct trade relations are minimal. We still don't have a bilateral investment treaty with the Russians. We've been negotiating with them for 17 years about admission to the WTO. It's argued that this is the year, 2011, it will happen, but there are no guarantees. There's still a chicken and egg problem. Russia has not brought its laws and regulations, its customs rules, its protection of intellectual property, and certainly its problem of corruption into compliance with international standards that would be required for the WTO, and the Russians make the argument, well, you've been promising this to us for 17 years, so why should we be the ones to make the first step? So we have kind of a chicken and egg problem. And then, of course, the United States has the problem of Jackson-Vanik, which is a law that was passed during the Cold War to punish the then Soviet Union for not permitting free immigration, particularly of Jews who wanted to leave the Soviet Union. Well, obviously, that's no longer directly applicable, but the argument is made by many members of Congress that if we lift it now, we'll be rewarding a country which still is corrupt, which still is autocratic, which still, in which journalists are murdered and, the cases are not investigated properly, in which political dissidents are still imprisoned. Why should we reward them when they haven't changed their behavior sufficiently? The problem is the sort of knife edge of Jackson-Vanik is that it denies permanent normal trading relations to a country. Well, if Russia enters the WTO and the United States is still denying them normal trading relations, then it's the United States that's in violation of the WTO treaty, and so Russia could impose retaliatory sanctions on us. So this is a real problem coming down the road if we do want to bring Russia into the World Trade Organization. President Medvedev has famously declared that Russia is open for business. This is part of his modernization scheme. And I think that's mostly a good thing for the United States. We have the opportunity, as I mentioned, to sell them, sort of high-margin luxury goods. The Russians love to buy fancy American cars and watches and things like that. European ones too, of course. And also to sell sophisticated machinery. This is something that the Russian extractive industries, when you're talking about oil and gas, really rely heavily on American technologies and sophisticated, sort of high-margin American machinery. But also all of the service sector, American lawyers and accountants and consultants are frequently working on major Russian projects. So this is a great boon, I think, to the United States. I think we'll probably see in the very near future an agreement to facilitate easing travel between the United States and Russia. It has been really anachronistic for the last decade, that at a time when we have now visa-free travel with countries like Ukraine, Poland, all throughout the sort of former communist bloc, you still have to fill out this extremely detailed application to get a visa to go to Russia and vice versa for Russians to come to the United States. It was only a couple of years ago that the Russians removed the requirement to get an HIV test in order for Americans to go there, and then technically when you're in Russia, you have to register your presence there. So unless you have a hotel with a concierge who will take care of it for you, which takes time, you have to go to the police station to register yourself. That's a real throwback to Soviet times. It's something, we have to get rid of these obstacles to citizen engagement, and I think that would be next on the agenda as well. And the US and Russia also need to work on an adoption agreement, because there are a lot of American families who want to adopt Russian children. It's happened before, but one or two bad apples, one or two bad stories coming out in the US and the Russian press has really interrupted this possibility, and the Russians have frozen adoptions at various points, leaving the children out of luck and the parents as well. We have a real challenge still ahead on human rights and democracy with Russia. This isn't going to be easy. Anybody who promises that there is some magic lever, some sort of, whether it's Jackson-Vanik or some new sanctions, there's currently a new piece of legislation before the Congress that's going to change Russia's behavior and its mentality on rule of law and democracy issues, I think is wrong. I don't think that this is an easy on-off switch kind of issue, even if we're willing to be as punitive as we can be. I think instead we need to do what's worked in the past, and that is we need to define very clearly those rule of law and democracy issues where the United States has a concrete national interest. Not only because that's in our interest to do, I mean, why should we tilt at windmills that have nothing to do with us, but because the Russians understand. When we say we're interested in letting these people emigrate freely, during the 1970s and 80s when we were negotiating on this with them. The Soviet Union didn't agree to do it right away, but they understood why we wanted it. They understood because we had domestic constituencies that were closely connected to those people. Whether you're talking about evangelical Christians or Jews or Armenians, there were many people who wanted to leave the Soviet Union, and we, the United States, cared about it because there were Americans who stood behind that. So I think we have to be very clear in that way, and I think then at least Russia will understand where we're coming from. We need to hold Russia to its freely undertaken international obligations, and that includes the Paris Charter for New Europe of the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, which has a human dimension that talks about the notion that human rights are no longer just a domestic issue. You can't cloak yourself in this veil of sovereignty and say nothing that happens within our borders matters to you guys on the outside. That's not true, according to the OSCE, which Russia is a member of. Russia participates in the European Convention on Human Rights, and therefore it's subject to the jurisdiction of the European Court on Human Rights. And I think we have to pressure Russia as much as possible to adhere to the decisions of that court, which often means paying judgments and indeed releasing people. I think it's very clear that U.S. businesses, if you look back at the Cold War, there were effectively 0 Americans, other than those living in Embassy Moscow, who were living in Russia. Today, that's not true at all. There are tens of thousands of Americans who are there temporarily and permanently. So we have a very clear interest in protecting the interests of those citizens, American citizens, to have access to justice through the courts, to have their assets protected, so that the government can't, either directly through simply repossessing their stuff or through so-called soft expropriation, effectively making their ownership rights non-existent through new laws, fighting those things in the interests of American citizens working in or working with Russia, I think is clearly in the American national interest. And lastly, I think the Obama administration in particular can make the argument they have staked a huge amount of political capital on the reset. And they can kind of make a Jerry Maguire argument. Help me, help you, right? We need Moscow to make it easier for us to have a good relationship with Russia. Because when bad news comes out of Russia and the American people hear that dissidents are being arrested, rallies are being quashed by the police, that there is nationalist violence, etc., it makes it very hard for the Obama administration to justify to Congress and the American people, why are you working with these guys? So I think that's a very clear interest-based argument that we can make. The alternative to this, as I said, is not only carrots and sticks, which I don't think is going to work very well, but it's also this kind of abstract argument. Well, we think human rights and democracy are good, we think they'd be good for you, so you should adopt them. It doesn't really work like that, because the answer from the Russian side could very well be, well, we agree with you, but we're only 20 years old as a democracy, so this is our version of democracy for the time being, give us time. And then we simply appear not to understand their circumstances when we say, no, you're not moving fast enough and we're going to punish you for it. It really makes us the enemy, not only in the eyes of the Russian leadership, but in the eyes of the Russian people, and I think that's a mistake. In security terms, I think there is some cooperation remaining after where we've gone with New START and the 1-2-3 agreement in Afghanistan. Both presidents have agreed to a goal of eliminating nuclear weapons in the world. They both signed up to the so-called zero agenda. We probably won't make any concrete progress on that in the next few years that Obama may have, but I think that there can be progress on specific sort of sub-issues. For example, much more transparency on Russia's tactical nuclear arsenal. Russia has probably around 4,000 of these so-called battlefield nuclear weapons that it has stockpiled from the Cold War. I mean, any one of these could destroy a major city, and if it fell into the hands of terrorists, I think would be a global catastrophe. So getting a handle on where these things are, making sure they're secure, and possibly reducing the numbers would be major progress. Russia is strongly interested in at least 2 things. One of them is that the United States has thousands of stockpiled nuclear weapons, which is weapons we've taken out of active service, but that have not been dismantled yet. Russia's obviously concerned that those could be deployed in the future. And the second is missile defense. Even though President Obama reversed course on the Bush administration missile defense plan, he sort of reversed course once again and is signing agreements to deploy missile defense in Eastern Europe. And that's viewed for Russia as the same type of threat to its strategic deterrent as missile defense under the Bush administration was. So progress on that may be possible. I mentioned the protracted so-called frozen conflicts. I think there are 2 major opportunities and goals there. One is Nagorno-Karabakh, which is a 20-year-old conflict between Armenia and Azerbaijan, kills dozens of people every year, on the so-called line of control between the two sides. I think the United States and Russia are better positioned than anyone to put tremendous pressure on the leaders of those two countries to stop the violence. And then the conflict in Transnistria, which is between Moldova, a former Soviet republic, and a small breakaway region that borders on Moldova and Ukraine, is resolvable. There is no question that given enough political will from Russia and the United States and the Europeans, this conflict can be resolved, and I think now is the time. And I think the last kind of security priority is, it's a bit of a tough fit for the notion of security because it's really almost more psychological and historical, but that's promoting the type of reconciliation that Poland and Russia have recently gone through, where they have sort of unearthed their shared tragic history, where the Soviet Union was executing Polish officers at Katyn, but then Poles were collaborating with the Nazis against the Soviet power. There's a sort of perception that they are ancient enemies, and this goes even actually before the 20th century. The same sort of process needs to be undertaken with the Baltic states, between the Baltic states and Russia, between Russia and Romania, to some extent even still between Russia and Western Europe. And I think that will really clear the air, because Russia relies so very heavily on its memory of having won World War II as being one of the key allied nations, that's really essential to its self-conception today. But if the nations that border it next door see the exact opposite picture, that Russia was the occupier, that in fact, the Nazi forces were the heroes because they supported national liberation movements, that this makes it almost impossible for Russia to have productive relationships with its European neighbors. Lastly, let me suggest that we need to try and minimize risk in the US-Russia relationship. I gave all the reasons why things could go wrong, and I talked about what has gone wrong in the past. But let's talk about a strategy for 2012. What happens if it is a President Putin? And by that I mean everything that Putin has come to represent, the sort of the power structures, this vertical of power, an autocratic way of thinking, using energy as a weapon, throwing Russia's weight around in the world. And what if it's a president on the American side who is less committed to the Russia relationship than President Obama has been? So we need what I might call, a 2012 strategy. And I think that strategy has to involve engaging the grassroots. Because at the end of the day, as long as we rely on political leaders to do relations between the US and Russia, they are going to be vulnerable and they're going to be thin. And I think we need a thick and a deep relationship. The way to do that, I think, starts with making visa-free travel much easier between Russia and the United States. That doesn't mean we get to a visa-free agreement in the next year, but that we have to move in that direction. We have to make it much easier for Americans who are interested in going to Russia to get to Russia and vice versa. I think we have to foster much more official exchange between the US and Russia, educational, cultural, sports. The Obama administration has begun doing that, but it's got to continue. And then I think we actually have to find real concrete business projects where Russians are bringing comparative advantage, Americans are bringing a comparative advantage, and we can do something together out in the world, maybe in a third country. I would suggest that the civilian nuclear industry is a great example of that, and we now have the legal framework for that under the 123 agreement. There's no one in the world who's better at doing nuclear stuff than the United States and Russia. For an unfortunate reason, which is that we built nuclear weapons to kill each other for a very long time, but that's almost the perfect situation, right? Sort of beat the swords into plowshares and go out into the world and bring peaceful nuclear power. There are many other things we can do, including, on the environment. Obviously, we share a massive interest in the Arctic, and, counterterrorism, counter-narcotics. So we have to keep forcing this cooperation until it becomes normal, until it becomes automatic. And that's ultimately what we want. I guess I'll end by quoting one of the president's senior advisors, who said that when it comes to this new reset relationship in the institutions, the Bilateral Presidential Commission and so on, that they have built, I asked, well, what's the long-term goal with this commission? And he said, well, the long-term goal is to keep the commission until we don't need it anymore. And I think that's really the goal. You want to build a relationship so that you don't have to force the relationship in the long term.